Good evening, good afternoon to everyone that's joining us here today for the webinar, COVID-19 Pandemic. Cuba shows that international solidarity is the answer. My name is Allison Bodine. I am an organizer with Friends of Cuba Against the US Blockade in Vancouver, Canada, and a writer and researcher with the Fire This Time newspaper. We are here today. Over 900 people registered to attend this forum to talk about the role that Cuba is playing today in fighting the COVID-19 pandemic, in fighting the pandemic despite being under a criminal US blockade for over 60 years. This webinar, which will feature the Cuban ambassador to the United States, among other honored guests, is organized by a group of organizations from the US and Canada that have come together to build a more united and stronger cross-border solidarity and anti-blockade movement here in the United States and Canada. We came together, first of all, to organize the second international conference for the normalization of US-Cuba relations, which was set to take place on March 21st and 22nd of this year, 2020. After the COVID-19 pandemic hit the United States, we knew that the conference wouldn't be possible, but coming together in this way, in a webinar and through many other organized online events and social media campaigns against the US blockade on Cuba has become important work at this time of COVID-19. So I welcome everyone to the discussion here tonight and call on all of you to join us in continuing to build for the Second International Conference on the Normalization of US-Cuba Relations, which is now scheduled for November 14th and 15th in New York City, and most of all to joining us in organizing to end the criminal and genocidal US blockade on Cuba. Tonight, the webinar will be co-chaired by myself, as well as Claudia de la Cruz. Claudia is an organizer, an educator, and executive director of the People's Forum. She is a longtime friend and comrade of the Cuban process and is going to tell us a bit about the forum here today.
Thank you so much, Allison. Well, first and foremost, I want to thank the organizers of this webinar. Cuba leads the global fight against COVID-19. I'm very excited to be co-chairing with my comrade and friend Allison, who I've known for a while, in Cuba solidarity work. And I'm also very honored to share space, virtual space, with our speakers tonight. As I mentioned before, or as it was mentioned before, my name is Claudia de la Cruz. I wanted to share a quote by El Comandante Fidel Castro, which I think reaffirms a lot of what the role of Cuba has been fighting this pandemic around the world. And he said, to be internationalist is to pay our own debt to humanity. These are words that reaffirm the values, the commitment, and the practice of the Cuban Revolution, not only at this time, but since its inception. It is of great importance to host this webinar in such critical times. At a global scale, humanity is experiencing at the very core the fragility of our existence. We need to reaffirm that COVID-19 is the virus, and the real crisis and threat to all living human beings is neoliberalism, is capitalism. And capitalist countries have continued to place profit over people. In the United States, we have experienced blatant disregard and incompetence from the Trump administration, allowing more than 14,000 people to die and close to 500,000 people to be infected by this virus. The virus has intensified social economic crisis that 140 million poor and low-income people were already experiencing in this country. In this process, the US government has also intensified its criminal attacks against Cuba and Venezuela and other 42 countries that are under US sanctions at the moment. And it's made it clear that the working class people of the United States have more in common with the people of Cuba and the people of Venezuela than we do with our own country, our own government. Cuba reaffirming the socialist values and principles, continues to be light and an example of solidarity and internationalism in these moments of global crisis. Cuba has intensified its historical contribution to the world with medicine and has intensified and sending off more medical brigades to impacted countries such as China, Spain, Italy, Iran, Barbados, and dozens of other countries with the purpose of saving lives. It is in the benefit of our humanity to build bridges of solidarity with our sister nation. And it is critical that we demand an end to the blockade, particularly at this moment. Blockades and sanctions are weapons of war, and we need to call them that. They are weapons of war. Our struggle is one in the defense of life. And so if there is a moment in our history to stand against the blockades and stand against sanctions, it is now. And so we thank everyone for coming together in this night. We need to continue to demand, but more importantly, build strategies that could help us end the blockade and end the sanctions around the world. Thank you, Allison, and everyone.
So for tonight's program, we are going to have about 45 minutes of speakers that come from a variety of backgrounds and perspectives about Cuba's fight against COVID-19. We will also be having a Q&A period following the speakers. So I encourage people, as we go through the forum tonight, to submit your questions through the Q&A box, which should be at the bottom of your screen. There we will see questions and combine them and hopefully have a very fruitful discussion on what Claudia has just ended with. What are the strategies? What can we do as people in the US and Canada to build a stronger movement against the criminal US blockade on Cuba and to support their international solidarity work now and beyond COVID-19? To start the program tonight, I am honored to present the Cuban ambassador to the United States, Jose Cabañas, who is joining us tonight to begin what will be a very great program introducing us to Cuba's international solidarity. We are again honored to have the ambassador here with us tonight. Thank you.
Regards to your audience, my respects to the panelists. You have many experts today to cover the subject. And as I see, we have many people following the webinar now. Well, the subject is very broad, but I will probably focus first in the way Cuba is facing COVID. As you said before, Cuba is facing now two pandemics, the COVID-19 and the blockade, which has been there for 60 years now, with a large effect on Cuba and Cubans and the world as well. We have, as we speak, I mean, Claudia was referring to how many places are receiving now the support of Cuba. And I think, let me say that I'm glad that this panel you have organized tells people that at least solidarity is not in quarantine, you know? And it's important that we exchange information and we know from each other. But as we speak, the 16th Brigade is departing for Angola. And now we have brigades fighting COVID in 16 different countries. But the way Cuba is supporting others is not limited to that. You know that before the pandemic, we had close to 30,000 experts in 59 different countries. Countries that now all of them are reporting cases of COVID. Then you have to add those countries to the 16 brigades were mentioned before. And there is a figure that usually is not mentioned, which is the human capacity we have helped to build in Cuba. As we speak, we have 37,000 experts in many countries, and more than 160 countries that graduated in medicine or related disciplines in Cuba. It's a large number of people that, as we speak, they are fighting the disease in their countries of origin. All along the years, the first brigade from Cuba that helped a country back in 1963 was Algeria, And since then, we have had more than 400,000 Cuban experts in different capacities in 164 countries. Then what we are doing today, as Claudia mentioned and she quoted from Fidel, is something that we have in our blood. It's something that the Cuban Revolution has been doing since very early in the existence. I would say that probably it's important for the audience to share with you, and I'm not an expert, I don't pretend to be, but some peculiarities of the way we are fighting COVID in Cuba. As you know, it was informed today, we have currently, we have reported 515 cases. We have regrettably 15 people who passed away, among them a few foreigners. As we speak, we have 1,860 people in hospital beds, and a little bit of more than 9,000 people on primary care, but at home. And they are the residences, and they have the family doctor coming by and the family nurse coming by very, very often. We have been following news in the United States and Canada and many countries, as some of them were caught by surprise by the pandemic. In so many cases, the system, the public health system is not working, or probably they are focused mainly on the people who have developed the disease, and they are in very serious condition. In our case, those cases we have reported is not only those people who felt sick, but the people we have screened. I mean, we have, and it was informed recently, we are close now to 9 million people in Cuba. We have been door by door knocking, asking families about symptoms. Then our system covers everyone's, and it's not about sick people going to the hospital. It's about the hospital or the system going after taking care of the population and trying to understand what is going on. As you know, our system is just one system, is integrated with different layers from the very bottom to the very top. Then our hospitals, our clinics, our experts are in permanent contact. They exchange information to each other. You have Cuban ministers, not only public health, but others, every night on primetime TV, informing the population that we have the population on board, and most of our citizens following the rules that have been set by our government and local authorities. That is important, and we understand that having the whole population on board, the whole population informed, is a very important tool to fight the disease, and at least in our case, it's showing results already. One other element is the protocol we follow in Cuba, and in those countries we are helping to fight the disease. Here, I have had the chance to talk to some hospitals and experts, and in many cases, you see a confusion about what to do and how to do it. Where we are working, as we have done before, closely with PAHO, with the World Health Organization. And although we don't have a cure, although we don't have a specific drugs to fight this disease, but there are protocols that we can follow and we can be successful. If you compare our numbers, I mean, the people who have developed the disease in Cuba and the people who have passed away, although if you have one casualty is a nightmare, but if you compare those numbers with the numbers you have in other countries, when the difference is in one way, probably the way we have faced the disease and the system we have put forward together to fight the disease. We still expect more cases, regrettably. It's a real possibility that we'll have more casualties. But again, it's nothing compared to other figures if we have taken a different path to fight the disease. And at some point it was mentioned, and when I refer to the protocol, and at least in our case, we have had the possibility to use a drug that was developed in Cuba in the early 80s as one of the main results of our biotech industry. Is widely known as interferon alpha 2B. And it's clear that this drug doesn't prevent the disease from developing, but it helps your immune system to fight the disease. And it's like a cane. I mean, you have difficulties to work, but it's like a cane. It helps. It has demonstrated the effectiveness. It was used in China, and we got reports that it worked in a positive way. And as we speak, we are exporting that drug to 15 different countries, and we have requests from those countries. In general terms, I would say this is the information we can share now with your audience about in how many places we are helping others. People are knowledgeable about our presence, for instance, in Italy or Andorra. It was pretty well publicized, but in countries, small Caribbean islands that don't receive a coverage usually by the international media, from St. Lucia to Jamaica to Barbados, those are countries that they don't have, they have limited resources. They are our sister and brothers. They are our family in the Caribbean, and we naturally we have to go to them first. As I said before, we have, as we speak, a brigade departing from Angola, an African country, and you know the links, the bilateral links we have developed for many years. That's in general terms the way we are fighting COVID. In Cuba, we are fighting COVID in many places in the world. And as you mentioned before, what we are doing, the way we are doing that is related to the blockade, which is, as I said, the pandemic we have been facing for 60 years now. It is affecting us. It has been affecting us for these many decades. Is today as illegal as it was before, is as immoral as I was before. And recently I was saying to someone that if the blockade is still there after the pandemic, it's basically a crime. And anyone supporting the blockade against Cuba these days is a criminal. I mean, there is no other way to describe that. During the last year, only during the last year, United States took 82 different actions, 82 different initiatives to enforce the blockade. From lifting the waiver on Title III of the Helms-Burton legislation to act and try to limit the supply of oil and gas to Cuba, up to talking to banks and imposing fines on different banks to limit our capacity for international transaction. It has been a manhunt during the last year. As I said before, this is something that has been there for many years, has been affecting the Cuban life, has been a crime. It has been condemned not only by the majority of the American population, the solidarity movement all over the world, that we appreciate a lot your support. It has been condemned every year by the large group and the largest majority of the international community. In many cases, the United States has voted alone against the majority of the world. But as I said, under these circumstances, to keep the blockade running is simply a crime. And those people behind it, those people supporting that in Congress, in the United States government, well, they will have to face the judgment by history today and tomorrow. We have been under difficult circumstances before. With the support of our people, our unity, we will overcome that. And I have no doubts in my mind that a very important role for us to overcome this situation is the international solidarity. And you were asking before, what could we do? Initiatives like this are very important. We are at home, we are in quarantine, but international support, solidarity should not be kept with a mask. I mean, we need to talk, we need to communicate to each other, we need to inform, and we need to share the best expertise and the best knowledge we can to fight the disease and move forward. It's important when we talk about actions and numbers and effect of measures, it's important to talk about knowledge. As much knowledge as we can share about this, the better for our people, the better for our countries, and the better to move forward. I will leave it there because I think we'll have the chance to respond to questions afterwards, but those will be my introductory remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Jose Cabañas. And we will have Dr. Helen Yaffe speaking next. She is a lecturer in economic and social history at the University of Glasgow, specializing in Cuban and Latin American development, and an activist with the British Campaign in Solidarity with Cuba.
Hi, can you hear me? So I'm a little bit concerned about my internet connection because it was cutting out when the ambassador was speaking. So make signs at me if it cuts out. I'm going to talk about Cuban medical science. Later on, Isaac and others are going to talk about interferon alpha 2b, which seems to have taken a lot of people by surprise around the world. But actually, Cuba has a quite incredible world-leading biotech sector. And I'm going to talk about that. But to start off, I think it's important to recognise, to appreciate what is exceptional about Cuban biotech. We need to know something about how the biotech sector emerged internationally and the premises that it operates on. So there's a lot of material in my book about this, and so I'm going to kind of race through this because there's quite a lot of ground to cover. But the biotech sector was launched in the United States with venture capital. It was just 5 years after the NASDAQ was first initiated for speculative, high-risk capital that you had the first biotech firm, which was in 1976. And it wasn't until 1980, again in the United States, that the second biotech firm was introduced. Now, this industry didn't take off in Europe until the 1980s, and then subsequently Japan, Singapore, China. Internationally, this is a really interesting fact about biotechnology. Internationally, the sector did not achieve profits from product sales until 2009. So not profitable in terms of the product, and yet billion, everything else, euros went to this sector. Money from venture capital, huge investments for big pharma. So why was that happening? Can you still hear me? Because it says my internet connection is unstable. Okay, great. How the sector was, without having, much to offer in the way of drugs at that point, financial mechanisms were enabling stock market investors to profit through trading biopharma stock, even when they didn't have a commercial product. And let's remember, we're talking about medicine, we're talking about medical products. So even without a product that fulfills the objective of curing people, they were making a profit. And that characterizes the capitalist biotech sector. Biotech products can take up to 20 years to commercialize. By 2002, there were only 100 biotech-related drugs that had reached the market in 30 years. By 2011, most biotech firms were doing these IPOs, which is initial public offerings of the stock market, raising money from people, actually had no product. So what we see is a sector that has the potential to provide cures for all sorts of ailments, but actually has been set up principally on the basis of making profit. Now, this doesn't mean that the biotech sector is something that only takes place in the private sphere, because actually behind all of this is a great deal of funding from public money. So the government funds basic science through the National Institutes of Health. It subsidizes the training of medical researchers. It decides what drugs or therapies to include in healthcare programs. The FDA regulates the manufacture and commercialization of conditions. So there's a lot of state involvement in this sector. Also, legislative support for the capitalist biopharma industry. Some of you will know about the 1980 Bayh-Dole Act, which gave private property rights to new knowledge that was created from federally funded research. So another mechanism of public money being shifted into the private sector. And in 1980, the Supreme Court ruled that genetically engineered life forms could be patentable. So you could claim private rights over them. So the point that I'm trying to make here is the question for the biotech sector is who controls production and distribution and in whose interests. Now, the curious case of Cuba, it was in 1981 that the Cubans, very much driven by the vision of Fidel Castro, set up something called the Biological Front. And this was a sort of forum of experts which had the intention of developing the sector in Cuba. And it was established just 5 years after the first biotech company in the world and 1 year after the second one. So before biotechnology was taken off as an industry in Europe and elsewhere, it was created independent from the Soviet Union, which obviously still existed in the Soviet bloc, but it was also completely independent from the corporate capitalist model of the biotech sector, which I've just talked about. And during the 1990s, the Cuban government invested $1 billion in this sector. And the result through the 1990s was the creation of what's known as the scientific pole, a collection of scientific institutes, research institutes, and so on, including biotech institutes in Western Havana. It's very interesting. If you read the literature on biotechnology globally, the scientific pole in Western Havana is almost never mentioned. So this whole development has taken place under the radar. What is completely distinctive about this industry is it's entirely founded with state investment. It's completely state-owned. Profit is not sought domestically, and there is no competition between institutions. In fact, there is cooperation. So they sit down regularly and discuss the kind of discoveries they're making, the innovations that they're making, and see how they can share those. The sector is also integrated into the state-funded public healthcare system and the education system, because of course you require that capacity of training to be able to have, there's tens of thousands of science graduates working in these institutions. And really importantly, the entire sector was set up and is driven by public health demand, not the pursuit of private profit. You have multidisciplinary teams that are set up to take projects through from conception, through the research, to producing the product and to marketing. And all the decisions are made in-house, which means that they're not dependent on the views of investors, they're not dependent on the views of speculators. And all of these factors mean that there is a fast track in Cuba from research and innovation to trials and application of their medical products. The examples of this are the 1981 development of interferons, and which I'm going to continue and talk about shortly, and that those were used for a deadly outbreak of dengue fever in 1981. And another good example is the meningitis B vaccine, which again I will mention later. Okay, so here is the interferon story. This is a picture of Fidel Castro in 1980 with a US oncologist, Randolph Lee Clark, who came to Cuba at the end of the Carter administration opening or slight in relations, and saw what they were doing, and had a conversation with Fidel where he persuaded him that interferons, the work that they were doing on interferons, was where progress was going to lie. And he offered to take one Cuban researcher to his laboratory. Fidel persuaded him to take two. What are interferons? Interferons are a protein that are released by human cells in response to infections, and they heighten the body's natural defense. So the question was, first of all, discovering interferons. This work had been done in London in the 50s, and it was being carried on around the world, then separating interferons from a human cell. So Cuban medical scientists then launched into this work. They began to work with interferons. They went to the US to work with Randolph Clark Lee, and they went to Finland to work with Kari Cantel, and subsequently they went around other places. Very, very shortly after spending a few days in Finland with Kari Cantel, who's the person who had developed a procedure to separate interferons from the human cells. I'm not a medical scientist, so you have to excuse my sloppy approach to the, the technical details. But very shortly after, they arrived from there, and they began to work immediately on producing a Cuban-owned interferon product. And they developed that in an incredible 45 days. And the product was verified by Cantel in Finland, in the laboratories. And it was just in time, because Cuba had a deadly outbreak of a dengue virus a few weeks later. And they used the interferon because of the fast track that they have in Cuba. The public health system was able to take this product and use it for the most extensive prevention therapy event with interferon in the world. Dr. Luis Herrera said in 1986, we have taken interferon as a model for the development of biotechnology in our country. He was part of the team from the Center for Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology, which did this work. In 1986, that was the year that they developed interferon alpha 2B. It was being developed by other capitalist biotech firms around the world, so Cubans were not the first globally, but the Cubans have achieved 99% purity in extracting the interferon molecule. So their product has very high efficiency and safety, and in that sense we can talk about a unique Cuban interferon alpha 2B. So this product started to be produced in China through a joint venture between Cuba and China called Shanghai in 2003. Subsequently, with the COVID-19 outbreak, it was on a list of initially 30 medicines which the Chinese National Health Commission selected to tackle the COVID-19 outbreak. And it appears that it has shown good results, because it is now at the top of the Chinese list for their protocol of treatments. Obviously, it will take a lot longer to be able to provide the scientific evidence, but the evidence on the ground, certainly in China, is that this product seems to be prioritized among the list. Okay, so I just want to, I think I've got about 3 minutes left to go through some of the other achievements of the Cuban biotech sector. It's really important to point out that the Cuban interferon alpha 2B is not an exception, a coincidence, a lucky breakthrough, but it is one of a set of products that actually justify the description of Cuba's biotech sector as world leading. Cuban professionals have received 10 gold medals from the World International body that rewards these things. 10 medals over 26 years. The first was for the world's first meningitis B vaccine. That was a huge breakthrough in the late 1980s and was almost entirely ignored in the world. So a few years ago in Britain, when they finally introduced the meningitis B vaccine for our National Health Service, they kept declaring that this was the first use of a meningitis B vaccine in a national healthcare system, which was a complete lie because Cuba had already been using it for 30 years. Other really important breakthroughs were Hepaprop P, which is a treatment for diabetic foot ulcers, which affects 400,000 people every year. There are vaccines for hepatitis B, dengue. Cuba has the world's first human vaccine with a synthetic antigen. Cuba has the first therapeutic lung cancer immunotherapy, the Simovax EGF. Many of you, I hope, will have seen the documentary that was on television last week, which tells the story about how that is now being trialed by Roswell Park in the United States. They also have a prenatal diagnosis, which that Cuba was the second country in the Americas to develop after Canada and before the United States. They have a center that produces 57 million tests per year for 90 different conditions. So that's why the Cubans have had the capacity to produce the testing equipment necessary during the COVID-19 outbreak. The Science City has some 50 institutions. It produces 8 out of 11 of the vaccines given to Cuban children, and that's to treat 30 diseases. And Cuba is also the first in the world to have eliminated mother-to-child HIV transition. So we're talking about nearly 200 inventions and products marketed in 49 countries, plus partnerships with 9 countries in the global south. Now, finally, I just want to say what it is, outline what it is that makes Cuba exceptional. It's the post-1959 commitment to free public health and education. The education is so important because it provides the critical mass of scientists to work in these institutions. State control in a planned economy, so there are no private interests, there is no speculation. And political will. Fidel Castro has played a really outstanding role in personal engagement, personally driving this sector, and in general, the effort to make science and technology methods or means to improve the socio-economic development in Cuba. The sector also builds on a long history of infectious disease research and vaccinations. Some of you will have heard of Carlos Finlay and the important work that he did with yellow fever. The other thing, of course, is to mention, we all know about the United States blockade, which has imposed the need on Cuba to really have a strong domestic production of medicines, because one of the things that are included in the blockade is medicine. And then there is the integration between universities, research centres, medical science enterprises, and public health systems. And that's me finished. I think I've gone 1 minute over, so I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Helen. I will say Helen is joining us all the way from Glasgow, so you can imagine it's very early in the morning for her, and she's sticking around for question and answer. So thank you, Helen. I also just wanted to say your introduction got a bit cut off, but we want to encourage people to check out her new book, We Are Cuba, How a Revolutionary People Have Survived in a Post-Soviet World, which has just been published by Yale Press, and you can find that online. Thank you again, Helen. Next, we have Dr. John Kirk. He is a professor at Dalhousie University and the author or editor of 18 books on Cuba, including Healthcare Without Borders, Understanding Cuban Medical Internationalism. Please welcome John. Are you here with us?
Yes, I am. And you've got the control for the slides?
Yeah, just give me 1 second and we'll get your slideshow right up.
In the 10 to 12 minutes allotted to me, I want to go over 60 years of Cuban medical internationalism. It's quite an impressive story. In many ways, it's the world's best kept secret. My own background, I did a PhD at the University of British Columbia, 73 to 77, and my PhD thesis was on the political thought of José Martí, and that was the influence in my career. I want to start off by showing a variety of places where Cuban doctors, nurses, and technicians have worked. Top right-hand side, this is in Guatemala. I spent 10 years ago, I spent 2 months with the Henry Reeve Brigade in El Salvador after a hurricane in San Salvador, Hurricane Ida, and then spent time in Guatemala with Operación Milagro, the eye surgery group, and then also went to speak with family doctors in El Salvador, Cubans in Guatemala. This was after Hurricane Ida in El Salvador. Bottom right-hand side, these are Brazilian students at ELAM, the world's largest medical school, and in the middle, Haiti. Okay. Next slide, please. So just to give you a rough idea, most people don't realize that Cuba has got a wealth of human capital. It has 95,000 doctors, 85,000 nurses. On a per capita basis, that's 3 times as many as we have in Canada and in the United States. It's an accessible service. It is free. It is a system based upon the idea of prevention rather than cure. Cuba produces just over 50% of its own medicines. And is also the basis, the most significant contributor of cash, of hard currency, 6.4 billion in 2018. Ambassador Cabañas talked about the number a period for a book that I wrote. And
your voice unfortunately dropped somehow for a bit. Okay. You might have to step back a few sentences.
Okay. So Cuba has, as Ambassador Cabañas pointed out, has had 400,000 medical personnel serving in 164 countries. Next, please. Next, Alison, please. ELAM, the Latin American Medical School, has graduated 29,000 doctors, mainly from Latin America, Caribbean, and Africa. You see the quotation from Margaret Chan, the former Director General of the World Health Organization. In addition, 25,000 doctors have graduated in Venezuela under Cuban professors. Timor-Leste, 1,000 doctors. It is quite extraordinary. In Pakistan in 2005, 1,000 Pakistani students came to study at ELAM, again, the world's largest Latin American faculty of medicine. Alison? Next, please. Cuba and Ebola. People tend to think that Cuba's role at present, sending 800 medical personnel to 16 countries, is quite exceptional and quite new. It's not. Since 1960, when the very first group of Cuban doctors went to Valdivia in Chile after there had been an earthquake, 2000, and then at the time, it's important to bear in mind, there were only 6,000 doctors in Cuba. By 1962, there were 3,000 doctors. So therefore, 3,000 doctors in 1962 up to 95,000 doctors at present. You can see how that has increased. There was one faculty of medicine at the University of Havana in 1959. There are now 24 faculties of medicine in Cuba. When Ebola broke out, and those of you who were around at the time will remember, the World Health Organization appealed for volunteers to come from around the world. The very first country to volunteer was Cuba. 256 Cubans went to 3 West African countries. Next, please. This is not a new story. This has been something that's been going on since 1960. You does see a quotation from Ban Ki-moon, the former UN Secretary General, and I think that's exactly what we're seeing now. The Cubans are always the first to arrive and the last to leave, and they always remain after the crisis. Cuba has a lot to show the entire world. With Ebola, Cuba was the first country to arrive and the last to leave, and the present pandemic affecting the entire world, Cuba is the only country which not only is dealing with its own problems, but is sending medical personnel to 16 countries. An extraordinary story. Next, Alison. Fidel Castro, I had the very good fortune in 1994 and 1996 to accompany the Premier of Nova Scotia, who was a family doctor, to Cuba and worked as his interpreter. There were several meetings with Fidel Castro. And at the meeting, Fidel talked extensively about access to health care being the most important human right for anybody in the world, and Cuba having the moral obligation to share what it has. It is in the Cuban DNA. From preschool to university, Cubans are socialized to believe that working with the collective is a moral imperative. And I think that the role of Fidel Castro is quite extraordinary. Operación Milagro, you see at the bottom, 34 countries, 4 million people after eye surgery have been able to see again. Quite extraordinary. Yes, Alison? Just some images. Top left-hand side, these are people from Jamaica receiving eye surgery in Havana. Bottom right-hand side, students from ELAM. ELAM, the largest medical school in the world. Again, 29,000 doctors have graduated from that. Next, Alison, please. Haiti at the bottom left-hand side. So we have continuity and change. We've got the solidarity tradition, but we also have a new approach. I think that in Qatar, in South Africa, in Angola, we have a model where countries that can afford to, on a sliding scale, are paying for medical care. In Qatar, there is a hospital with 400 Cuban doctors, nurses, and technicians. We also have an army of white coats, of batas blancas, who could work for the WHO. And one of the things that I hope after the dust and the smoke settle from the pandemic will be the need the realization that we need to work together in multilateral fashion around the world to rejoice the idea of me first, but to realize that pandemics recognize no borders. The WHO will need to fulfill its mandate an army of medical personnel. No one is better qualified. No one has more human capital than Cuba to help with that. Yes, Alison? Next. Margaret Chan, again, great quotation from her. Train excellent doctors and nurses. It's almost famous for its generosity and solidarity towards developing countries. It's exactly true. Yes, please, next. We have a new model. Roswell Park has been mentioned by Helen. Qatar has been extremely important. Biotechnology, Helen mentioned again. Medical tourism in a saner world would be worthwhile. And the coronavirus impact shows the potential that Cuba has to take its medicine around the world. Next, Alison, please. We have coronavirus. We see the 16 countries. You may have heard about the MS Braemar. This was a ship with 1,000 passengers and crew members that needed to be landed, to dock. No other Caribbean country would allow it to dock. Cuba allowed it to do so. The criticism's been made. The US State Department in the Twitter last week said that Cuban doctors were only there to make up for dollars they'd lost in Brazil. What a stupid criminal observation to make, an immoral observation. How can you possibly criticize a country which is sending 800 people to 16 countries to try to save lives and to try to denigrate it in that way? It is absolutely unacceptable. Medical aid from Alibaba last week was stopped again because of fear of the Helms-Burton legislation. Next, please. Again, the Braemar, top right-hand side, arriving in Havana. The bottom right-hand side is of interest to Canadian viewers. This is a chief from an Indian reserve in Manitoba, visiting Havana, wants to bring indigenous students to study at ILAM, wants also to bring Cuban doctors. The Canadian government, I think out of embarrassment, is blocking the way for this to happen. I think that Cuban doctors should come to Canada. Yes, please, next. So to tie up the loose ends, in the last 30 seconds, Cuba has offered freely when it's needed to poor countries. It has gained massive international prestige. I would argue that it is in the Cuban DNA. And if you look at the preamble to the Cuban Constitution, you will see that there's a moral obligation for Cuba not to give its leftovers, but to share what it has. It's ratified in the Cuban Constitution. Cuba has got a surplus of of human capital in medicine. I think fair trade with Venezuela, which has a surplus of petroleum. The forthrightness of Fidel Castro should not be forgotten. Next slide, please. The moral leadership of Cuba is extraordinarily important in the world. A couple of books that one on the right-hand side I wrote, Healthcare Without Borders, the one on the left-hand side I co-wrote. And in the middle, we see a quotation from, this is from Italy for the Cuban doctors. You are the true heroes. Honor to the doctors and to the nurses. And I think that's exactly true of what we're seeing with Cuban medical internationalism. We have a lot to learn, and Cuba has taken the high road. I mentioned that I did my PhD thesis on the socio-political thought of Jose Marti. All of this can be summed up in a beautiful three-word phrase of Marti: Patria es humanidad. All of humanity is our country, our homeland. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kirk, for reminding us and sharing about the moral leadership that Cuba has shown the world. Our next speaker is Dr. Alexa Weber. She has a medical degrees in dentistry and psychology. After receiving her master's degree in public health from Harvard University, she worked from 1989 to 1994 as a director of the dental division of the Department of Continuing Education and Research for Venezuela's Ministry of Health. She since spent many years researching numerous public health issues for the country. She continues her solidarity today as president of the Círculo Bolivariano in Miami. Welcome, Dr. Weber.
For and giving me the chance to express the gratitude of you, always working for those like us that need to express the criminal blockade, the criminal sanctions that are affecting our people. But because of these US criminal sanctions, financial sanctions, we have become very creative, very frugal. And at this time that we have to confront this pandemic, we have developed since 2003, with the help of 30,000 Cuban doctors, a healthcare system that is compounded by 572 health centers all around the country. It has all the specialties. It also has a small emergency and triage department. And if those attending in those centers need tertiary care, they are referred to our big hospitals that were already existing in the country. these 30,000 doctors have been substituted little by little by doctors that have been trained now in Venezuela by a school of medicine that was founded with the help of our brothers Cubans, our neighbors, brothers, Cuba, always Cuba. At this moment that we have this pandemic, the president decided to allocate the 572 centers, health centers, to take care of this pandemic with a total of 4,800 beds. Our first contaminated patient came from Spain in March 13. And it was tested, it was positive, it was a woman. It was quarantined, and all the people around in the plane that had contact with her were traced, were quarantined, and were followed up. Then we had another patient that came contaminated from Cucuta, Colombia. And immediately the president declared state of alarm. Now it's March 14. And he declared a quarantine for 7 states. These states were those that are colliding with Colombia, make frontier with Colombia, which are Zulia, Táchira, and Apure state, but also the state of Caracas, where our main airport is and where people were coming from other countries, particularly from Europe. And La Guaira, he also quarantined Miranda, which is people with more resources in our country that travel the most. And we got 30 experts from Cuba to help us to handle the epidemiological side of it. And we received shipments from Russia and China for PPEs, kits to have tests, masks, or what we needed for this pandemic. Also, through our communities organization, we have a plan called Plan de la Patria, which is a program that implies that all the people in Venezuela that are subscribed to this plan get their pensions, their bonds, their helps, their scholarships. And a questionnaire was sent to this plan so the government could identify those that could be in high risk. 19 million questionnaires were answered, and out of those 19 million, 125,000 people were considered at high risk. Immediately, it was ordered a trace of all those people, visit them, and so far 95,000 visits have been done, and we have till yesterday, 177 cases. We lost 7 patients. And today it was announced that 4 more people were identified as contaminated. One was a woman that entered illegally from Colombia and she was contaminated and contaminated a member of her family, which was a 13-year-old kid. And also someone that came to our Margarita Island that was also contaminated and contaminated somebody else. So far, with the help of Cuba and with our healthcare system and with the discipline of our people, we have been able to contain the pandemic. They have respected the quarantine. Now, one of the problems that was presented with this quarantine is food distribution. As you know, given the sanctions, we had to develop a system to assist the people with the food that they need. But now they couldn't go to our markets to get them, or to the meetings in the community to get their boxes of food called clubs. So the idea that came was they're gonna have one person with a little pickup truck that is going to distribute the boxes door by door, and through your ID, you register before and said, I want a club, I need a club, one of my boxes with food. And you pay through the ID, your Carnet de la Patria, which is like a credit card where you get all your salaries and all your help and all your pensions, and then you receive your club. That way, we didn't have to have the community to go out and get the boxes. That club box right now has a cost of 65,000 bolivares, which in dollars is like 80 cents of a dollar. So you can see that the Venezuelan people are buying subsidized food so we could confront these sanctions. Now we have the problem how we're gonna give enough proteins to our people, because in the club box, you get oil, rice, milk, pasta, tuna, you get cornmeal to prepare our main bread, that we prepare our cornbread. But now we had open markets established by the government, and they rotate around the country, in which you get chicken, you get eggs, you get fish or meat. So now what is being done is to assess what are the needs of every family, and those proteins are gonna have to be brought to their houses also, leave them at the door so we can continue with the quarantine. So you can see that we have become very resourceful in ideas to survive this crisis that these sanctions have created. And people are responding. We have a great solidarity in the communities. They support our revolution. We have given the people so far 3 million decent housing, which if you multiply by 4, we're talking that 12 million people have received a decent house where they can have clean water, wash their hands, and better health conditions. Because it's not only having a health program, it's giving them a quality of life in the way they conduct their lives every day. The goal of this program, housing program, is 5 million. Venezuela has a population of 30 million people. So if our goal is to build 5 million houses and you multiply by 4, it's telling you that 20 million of Venezuelans were living in shanty houses in terrible conditions that now are enjoying a way of living that can allow us to prevent other diseases, airborne or waterborne or foodborne, that has created a Venezuela with some scarcity, because yes, we have had difficulties getting medicines. I give you an example. A few years ago, Venezuela sent to Euroclear $2.5 billion to buy medicine, to buy vaccine, to buy chemotherapy, to buy insulin, all what you need to take care of a population. And it's frozen. We haven't been able to get it. And we have had the need to go and buy it in Russia, in India, in China, or Cuba has been our great protector and our great helper to be able to go through this crisis of medicine scarcity. So we have total in Venezuela, 23,500 beds. We don't think we're gonna have a pandemic as awful as we have seen here in New York, which has almost the population of Venezuela, but we are ready. Also, we have fast kits to test people, the blood test that is done, and we have the pharyngeal test to really confirm this is the coronavirus. So we've been able to test people, to trace people, to quarantine people, and so far it's working. So I want to unite my voice to the Cuban ambassador, to this criminal blockade, these criminal sanctions that are putting our people to suffer. We can provide ourselves if they don't steal our investments. We had a big company in the United States that was Citgo, that was giving cheap oil in winter to communities in Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, some states, and it has been robbed from us, a criminal robbery that has prevented us from getting the much needed resources or money to attend our necessities. So through this webinar that we're having, I want you to understand all what the United States have tried to destroy our revolution. It is the will of the people that have maintained this revolution. Now they're trying to accuse our president of narco traffic, which is an absolute absurd. They're talking about a naval blockade, and everybody knows that we don't have a coast with the Pacific. We all know that the traffic goes from Colombia to the Pacific, to Mexico, to United States. We all know that the United States has 9 military bases in Colombia, and yet they cannot stop that, or is that they don't have the will to stop it. So they're gonna continue attacking us. I think we are determined to continue this revolution. We have the support of many people around the world that understand our reality. And we have Cuba, always Cuba with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Weber. I think it's important when Venezuela is under such clear attack by the US government and their allies that we elevate our campaign against blockades and sanctions, and also the international solidarity and cooperation between Cuba and Venezuela, not only now, but for many years before. So thank you for your presentation.
My pleasure.
For our last speaker tonight, before we get into Q&A, I want to welcome Dr. Isaac Saini. He is a Cuba specialist at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Canada, and is co-chair and spokesperson for the Canadian Network on Cuba. He is the author of Cuba, A Revolution in Motion, and is currently finishing Africa's Children Return, Cuba and the Global Black Liberation Struggle. Thank you, Isaac.
Thank you. And so it's a pleasure to be here. And I see we've had at one point almost over 600 people attending this webinar. And I think basically to talk about a subject that we're all very concerned about. And what I want to talk about now is perhaps what, in a sense, was the crystallization of this webinar. It's not just simply our commitment to challenge disinformation about Cuba, to focus on Cuba's tremendous medical internationalism and solidarity to the world, which is an example that foreign relations don't have to be based on real politics, but can be based on true internationalism, solidarity, and social love. But also to talk about what we're dealing with in the midst of this global pandemic of COVID-19. As we know, in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen that in the case of the United States, it has been spiraling. And so right now we have over 450,000 cases in the United States, which represents 29.37% of the global total. The United States is now the epicenter of our COVID-19. The total number of US deaths are now over 15,000, nearly 16,000, and these are based on sort of very regularly updated Johns Hopkins University figures, which represent 17% of the global deaths. We also know that there's a disproportionate impact on the most vulnerable, oppressed, and disenfranchised. We know at the front and center of these struggles are workers. We know that in a sense, this crisis has in many eyes restored the dignity of labor, because those jobs that perhaps were looked down upon, were denigrated, have now become essential to the operation and sustaining of our lives. People who work in grocery stores, people who do what normally were considered menial tasks. We've also seen that among African Americans, this crisis has been particularly disproportionate. For example, in Michigan, as you can see, 14% of the population is African American, yet 33% of the cases are from the African American community and 41% of the deaths. In the case of Louisiana, 32% of the population are African Americans, yet they have 70% of the fatalities. And in Chicago, 72% of the deaths are African Americans. This reflects the long history of disenfranchisement, marginalization, oppression, and the imposition of white supremacy, the functioning of anti-Black racism. But also among indigenous peoples in the United States, we see this also being reflected here in the Navajo Nation, which is located across 3 states in the United States. There are at least 384 confirmed cases and 15 deaths. And more than 76% of Navajo households suffer food insecurity. One of the things driving this, or what people call, what driving this crisis of COVID in the African American and the indigenous community, is what people often call the social determinants of health, in terms of comorbidities, underlying conditions that come from lack of proper nutrition. In Canada, and I will get to that, as was alluded to by John Kirk, we also have a similar issue in the Black communities of Canada, and also in the indigenous communities, what we call First Nations. There was a call from Grand Chief Jerry Daniels of the Southern Chiefs Organization, which represent the Anishinaabe and Dakota First Nations in Southern Manitoba, which is a province in Canada, basically for doctors from Cuba, not only because these doctors have the experience in COVID, but precisely as well because there are not enough doctors in Canada to provide the assistance they need, and they suffer from lack of proper housing, lack of running water, and a whole number of inequalities and inequities that make them particularly vulnerable to COVID-19. And so Chief Daniel, as you can see in this quote, says quite clearly, Canada does not have enough healthcare workers to mitigate the spread of COVID-19 and to address the numbers of upcoming cases in First Nations communities. So as John Kirk said at the end of his presentation, perhaps Cuba's internationalism, its selfless solidarity and generosity to people, what the late great Norman Gervan called an unpayable debt, can be summed up in these 3 words uttered by Jose Marti, in many ways the father of the Cuban nation. Patria es humanidad. In a sense, homeland is humanity, humanity is homeland. And so this, in a sense, has provided us, looking at this crisis that's unfolding in the United States and spiraling out of control, for us to launch a campaign called US-Cuba-Canada Collaboration in Fighting COVID-19. It is a call of the National Network on Cuba in the United States and the Canadian Network on Cuba. And our call is simply this: COVID-19 is ravaging the United States. Day by day, hour by hour, the infected and fatalities continue to spiral ever upward, with the most vulnerable communities, especially African Americans, disproportionately affected. The entire healthcare system is being strained beyond its capacity to provide adequate care and treatment, with doctors, nurses, and other healthcare workers driven to exhaustion and beyond in their valiant efforts to save lives. A pandemic is by definition global. Surely, in the face of this worldwide menace, now is the time for international medical cooperation and solidarity. A time for joint efforts to confront COVID-19. A time to put political differences aside in order to save lives. It is for this reason that we are launching a campaign to call for medical collaboration with Cuba to gain access to Cuban medical expertise to assist in the fight against COVID-19. Many countries are now drawing on Cuba's expertise in fighting COVID-19. At the time of writing, Cuba has more than 800 medical personnel serving in 18 countries, including especially hard-hit Italy and Spain. In the coming days and weeks, more Cuban medical missions will be dispatched to other countries. These missions reflect Cuba's long history of medical internationalism. Many of the medical personnel now intimately involved in the fight against COVID-19 are part of the specially trained Henry Reed International Medical Brigade against disasters and serious epidemics, which distinguished itself in the fight against the Ebola epidemic in West Africa. Cuba also offers treatment regimens, some of which are not available in the United States and Canada. A key component of the protocols being used on the island and in the medical missions is Cuba's interferon alpha-2b recombinant. While Cuba's interferon is not a panacea, preliminary reports are promising, pointing to its efficacy in combination with other drugs in treating COVID-19. In a recently published extensive medical handbook by Zhejiang University School of Medicine in China on how to treat COVID-19, Cuba's interferon is a crucial component of the antiviral treatment to combat the coronavirus. It is also used as a preventative measure to protect healthcare workers from contagion. At least 45 countries have sought to use Cuba's interferon alpha-2b recombinant for confronting the COVID-19 pandemic. We therefore call on the US and Canadian governments to lift restrictions on access to Cuban medical expertise, including the importation of Cuban interferon alpha-2b recombinant in order to more effectively combat the COVID-19 pandemic. A precedent for this opening and cooperation has already been established by a joint venture facilitated by New York Governor Andrew Cuomo between Cuba's Center for Molecular Immunology and Buffalo's Roswell Park Comprehensive Cancer Center, which helped develop the Sinovac vaccine, the Cuban lung cancer vaccine. There was also the collaboration between medical personnel from Cuba and the University of Illinois on infant mortality in Chicago. This campaign will also benefit Canada, particularly Indigenous peoples and Black communities that are at the most risk from COVID-19. For example, the Canadian government has turned down the request for Cuban doctors by the Southern Chiefs Organization representing the Anishinaabe and Dakota First Nations in Southern Manitoba. We call on people to join us and support us in this call for medical collaboration with Cuba. Cuban medical expertise can and will save lives. As Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez stated, humanity faces a common challenge. This pandemic does not respect borders or ideologies. It threatens the lives of all, and it is everyone's responsibility to address it. So we are specifically calling for 1, incorporating Cuba's interferon alpha-2b recombinant in clinical trials in the US and Canada. 2, US Food and Drug Administration approval for Cuba's interferon alpha-2 recombinant. And 3, allowing US-Cuba-Canada medical collaboration. And finally, 4, ending US economic and travel sanctions against Cuba, including its extraterritorial nature and the attempts to stop all other countries accepting Cuban medical brigades. Please endorse this campaign. We have an email at interferon@us-cubanormalization.org. And you can use the statement, this call that we have developed, which will be put on our website, this letter by sharing and sending it to medical personnel, unions, elected officials, community, faith-based, and political organizations. We believe that if we are successful in this campaign, not only will we save lives, not only will we stem the COVID-19 pandemic, but we will also contribute to making a better world possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sini. Thank you, everyone, all of the great panelists that we've heard from tonight. Just a couple of things. We're gonna get into the Q&A portion and the discussion of our gathering. 2 brief announcements. Unfortunately, the folks that are on the phone, we won't be able to get your questions unless you email us. And the email address is info@us-cubanormalization.org. And I'll say that again, info@us-cubanormalization.org. Also, if folks would like to get the video of this webinar, you could go on the website, us-cubanormalization.org, and the video will be uploaded there. So we will start with questions that have been placed on the Q&A chat, just so that everyone knows there's a whole lot of questions, and that's great because that means that folks have been very attentive to the presentations and also have come onto the webinar with the questions that they desire to get some answers to. Unfortunately, we won't be able to get to a whole 100 and some plus of them, but we will get to some. And so the first question I wanted to direct to Ambassador, and it's a question regarding the lies and the narratives that have been going on in the US with regards to Cuba's medical international solidarity. There's been a lot that has been said in terms of doctors being coerced into working in international missions. And, you know, obviously many of us know that that's not the case, but we're wondering if you could respond to that.
In terms of Cuba, United States, basically the State Department, the White House, many times, they have found always an argument to look somewhere else. Remember that the whole blockade was based on our relationship with the former Soviet Union and the Republic of China, the People's Republic of China. The Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. China is the largest US trade partner. Then it's not an issue. At some point was our support to political movements and parties in Central America. At some other moment, it was our presence in Africa. And nowadays, it's our support to Venezuela, Nicaragua, and others. Then they always find an argument to distract people and not to talk about the essence here. You have had experts today, Professor John Kirk, who has been with our brigades in many countries for several years. People like him who accompany our physicians, they know firsthand why they go there. You have mentioned how it's in our DNA, in our blood, to support others. I remember when our people was assisting Haiti after the earthquake, or Pakistan after the earthquake in the year 2005, they were asked, when did you arrive? And they told everybody, we were here before, and they never left. In the case of Haiti, they never left. We have still 500 experts in Haiti, helping the Haitian people to overcome this pandemic. Then again, it's a distraction. I mentioned how you can put under coercion 400,000 people to go to a place where they don't want to be. Remember that for many years, United States had a parole program for physicians all over the world to take them out of their missions. They implemented that for several years. It was a way to reduce, to affect in some way our presence in those countries. They have their argument today, and probably they have a different argument tomorrow. But the point is, with all resources the United States has, we challenge them to do something similar to what we are doing. Not to have as many experts as we have today, 30,000 people in different countries, but simply a percentage of that. If they have the capacity to mobilize people to help others, they simply can't, and that's why they attack us. Thank you for your question.
Is there anyone else that wants to address that question?
I would like to make a comment. I went 5 years around Venezuela, and in every little corner we find these Cuban doctors taking care of people that never have seen a doctor in their lives. I remember in a little corner in the east side of the Sucre state, I went with my husband, who is a physician, and they have this health center, and there was this woman that was an internist in her 30s, And there was this very well-trained doctor that was a university professor and now was in Venezuela, giving the best that he could give to all those people in that community. And I went all around Venezuela and they all were so happy. The community adored them. They would receive cakes and food, and they were invited to the parties, and they became part of the community. They really love what they're doing. They have a lot of ethics in what they're doing. And I think knowing the system here in the United States, I think the solidarity that will be needed to have something like Cuba has had around the world. We will need to create a new American to understand what solidarity means. It's very difficult for them to conceive that in terms of what Cuba is doing around the world. When I said Americans, I want to talk about the government, because many American people understand what the United States is doing in other countries and they're very much against it. I just wanted to glorify this labor that the Cuban doctors are doing in our countries. I've seen that in Bolivia, I've seen that in Ecuador, I've seen that in Colombia. I've seen wherever they go, wherever they deliver a lecture, it's just so much giving. So I wanted just to add that. Yeah.
And if I may add something, I think it's especially poignant and ironic that Bolsonaro in Brazil, who expelled the Cuban doctors, is begging them to come back.
In Bolivia.
Yeah. Okay, because obviously these doctors provided healthcare where no doctors with a capitalist ethos would ever serve. These doctors have proven indispensable.
Thank you. So I'm getting a number of questions about the interferon alpha 2B campaign. I wanted to say I've posted the email address in the chat. Everyone that's participating over Zoom on the internet should see the typed email, but I'll read it out again. It is interferon@us-cuba-normalization.org. You can also visit the website us-cuba-normalization.org to get more information, including the letter that Isaac referred to. Again, this is a campaign sponsored by the Canadian Network on Cuba, as well as the National Network on Cuba, and the group that came together to organize tonight's webinar. A number of people are asking for more details about interferon alpha 2B, how it's being used as a treatment, more specifically, it's how it works medically, how doctors or nurses could find out the protocols for using it. So I'm wondering if anyone can address that directly or just point us to good resources in English or Spanish to find out more specifics about this drug. And then Dr. Kirk, someone has also asked if it's being used here in Canada. So if anyone has that information as well.
Okay. If I may, I'd like to say about the campaign itself, we're involving scientists and medical professionals. So we have them involved. The interferon, as I said before, and as Helen has pointed out, and as Dr. Kirk has pointed out, and as the ambassadors pointed out, the initial results coming out of China, of Italy, are very, very encouraging about interferon. The question, and there's also a number of scientific papers that are now being submitted to academic journals in the scientific field that are beginning to really explore and explain and talk about its impact and so forth. Now, I'm a historian. I'm not a medical professional or scientist. And so that's why we decided to put scientists and doctors front and center in this campaign. One of the key things we're looking for is a partnership of universities, for example, hospitals, to have clinical trials of interferon. But the fact that the Chinese, who had that tremendous experience, as Dr. Yaffe pointed out, with interferon, have made it a key component of the treatment, points to the fact that this is a drug and a treatment, right, that should be deployed. In Cuba, it is used as well, and we should also notice as well that Cuba is also deploying in the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. They're also deploying a number of other drugs they've actually developed, right? There's over a dozen drugs that Cuba has developed specifically to boost the immune system that they're developing, but interferon alpha-2b recombinant is at the top of that list. So one of the things we're doing within this is gathering the literature. So for example, on the website for the conference itself, we're creating a separate one in which the scientific papers and other things written about it will be there as a repository, and the scientists themselves are really going to be driving out information on this as well. But in terms of Canada, I know, and John perhaps can correct me, but I've looked on the Department of Health in Canada, or they has a page, part of the government page, where they list all of the drugs for COVID-19 that are being trialed in Canada, and Cuba's interferon alpha-2b recombinant is not being trialed. So I don't think it's available in Canada as well. And so this is a drug that's promising, and if, for example, if they can test if they can test the chlorine, what's you want to say, John?
Hydrochloroquine.
Hydrochloroquine. If they can test that on the whim of a certain person who has considerable power, interferon, which has so much considerable evidence behind it, I don't know why that cannot be clinically tested in the United States and Canada. And perhaps others who have more knowledge can chime in at this point.
I can just say something really unspecialist about how the interferon works. So as I said in my talk, the interferons are something that the body produces to fight against pathogens, whether they be viruses, bacteria, tumors, and so on. So what this antiviral drug does is it increases the level of interferon in the body, so it assists people to fight the virus themselves. And you know, I think it's worth pointing out that the Cubans have had quite remarkable success where they have used the interferon, first just straight up interferon and then interferon alpha-2b on their own populations, and it has been used elsewhere. So, I mean, clearly COVID-19 is a new virus, and we can't yet say exactly how well this is working, but the fact that the Chinese have said, you know, their protocol of how to treat the outbreak now lists interferon alpha-2b at the top. So that's all I can say on that, really.
And I'd like to add, if I may, I have to add a point here that's important to understand. The United States produces copious amounts of interferon. They actually produce an alpha-2b interferon, but the Cuba's alpha-2b interferon is unique. Okay, people have to understand this. And I think one of the things we're facing, and I think it's a profound Eurocentrism, it's a profound devaluing of the fact that the so-called third world can be a generator of knowledge and can actually have scientists, is this sort of prejudice that any form of knowledge, any form of advance can come from outside of the Western world, right? So there's an anti-Chinese bias, there's an anti-third world bias. And for example, before we actually began this webinar, some of you may have seen the documentary speaking about Cuba's lung cancer vaccine when Dr. Kirk was interviewed. One of the things that stands out in that documentary for everyone is the surprise of these US scientists that Cuba actually has a scientific community. Okay, so I think that's one of the things that we're fighting against, which is that prejudice that knowledge can only exist in the West. It can't exist in the so-called third world of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and so on. So I think that's, and even though there's mounting evidence that points to Cuba's interferon alpha-2b recombinant actually having a significant amount of efficacy in treating COVID-19.
Thank you, Isaac. And the ambassador, please.
Yes, if I may jump into those comments, which are completely relevant from Professor Helen and Professor Isaac. Well, I can refer also to the documentary broadcasted by PBS April the 1st, because the explanation is very graphic. I mean, you can understand easily. You don't need to be an expert to understand that. And I will share with Professor Isaac that there is not a lot of knowledge in general, you know, in the American public. But keep in mind that our two scientific communities, they have been in cooperation for 150 years. I mean, we have had the blockade, but around the blockade, scientists in Cuba, in the United States, in Canada, of course, and many other countries, UK, they have had the chance to talk to each other, to do joint research, to attend international events. If you ask me 10 years ago, well, probably there was a question mark about basic sciences in Cuba. If we were capable or not, if we had a system or not, if we have the human resources or even the facilities to do that. I think, at least in terms of the scientific community in the United States, that debate is gone. People know that we have the resources and the knowledge to do that. It's important to note also that in 2016, we signed a bilateral MOU on health, which is a very comprehensive one. And I have to say that many experts, no authorities, but experts who were involved in that debate and attended that debate, they are still around in some federal institutions in the United States. And what we have been talking now about interferon and alpha-2b specifically and others is very well known in that community. But it's about political will. I mean, it's not the lack of knowledge about how we produce that, where do we produce that, if that is effective or not, is political will. And as Professor Helen said before, the biotechnology sector in Cuba, what we call it before the scientific pole, which is BioCuba Pharma these days, probably was a secret. But remember that in the year 2002, a person who is now working with this administration referred to that effort as an effort from Cuba to develop biological weapons. And he said that at the time when we were welcoming President Carter in Cuba. President Carter was visiting those facilities, and he said, well, if these guys are building weapons on these sites, I don't have a clue about that. And then for many years, and my first question was on argument, for many years, United States has been building arguments to put a question mark on Cuba. But the point is, they never ever have provided evidence to support those arguments. Thank you.
Thank you for answering that. So we're trying to combine some of the questions. There's a question, or there have been questions with regards to the blockade. And folks are wondering, why is the blockade still standing even though most nations are against it? There's also the question in terms of the blockade and the impact that it's currently having with the COVID-19 in terms of financial strain and lack of imported goods. And I would extend that question also to Dr. Weber in terms of Venezuela. So if both of you or folks could feel free to share how the blockade is impacting the population, the finance aspect of it, and the lack of imported goods, both in Cuba and Venezuela.
Well, if I may, I can jump again, if I'm allowed to. It's a very good question. Why the blockade is still in place? Well, my first reaction to that is it's still in place because American democracy doesn't work in the way it's supposed to work. If you ask the majority of the people in this country, and we until recently we visited the states. I mean, last year we visited 22 different states in the United States and many cities. And remember that 12 cities in the United States they have passed resolutions against the blockade. If the American democracy were to respond to the will of the majority of people, it should be over. It's an state policy that has been developed. I mean, this is not the accidental will of a few politicians in one particular moment. It has been a state policy that was created, at least the willingness to impose those sanctions very early in 1959, reacting against the Cuban Revolution. and against the will of the large majority of countries in the world. And by the way, many people in the United States, politicians, they have described the blockade as a bilateral issue with Cuba. It is not. And we have a lot of evidence to demonstrate that. And how many people are affected. And you can see these days a small country like Andorra and the foreign minister saying, we are a small country, but we make our own decision. Because believe it or not, United States officials have been after foreign governments in Italy, in Andorra, in all those countries where we have experts these days, after a president, after a minister, asking them, begging them not to receive, not to accept the Cuban help. Then it's a comprehensive policy that applies to all sectors in our life. It affects today, as I say at the beginning, currently you have everybody fighting COVID pandemic. We are fighting two pandemics, the blockade and the COVID-19. If the American democracy were to work at least once, following the principles they proclaim, they should respond to the majority, the will of the majority of the people in this country, and reject the blockade. Thank you.
Dr. Weber, would you like to jump in?
Well, if we're going to see how a blockade or a financial strangulation that the United States is doing to Venezuela, we can think of how do we get parts for our medical equipment? How do we part for our cars? How do we get medicines around the world if we're not allowed to trade in dollars? How can we try to commercialize if we're not allowed to commercialize with any company around the world? So that is affecting the everyday life of people. That is affecting the prices that we pay to receive products. And for example, inflation. Every product that we need that is not produced in our countries, we have to import from very far away places because we're not allowed to commercialize with people closer to us. We have lost the capacity to commercialize with our neighbors because they have put now governments that have attacked the Cuban doctor, the Venezuelan trade, like Ecuador, now Bolivia, Brazil, and that has affected our life, the sanctions. For example, if you need, as a dentist, you need dental material to take care of the population. They're so expensive and there's only a few that you can get because they are produced mostly in the United States, Germany, or Japan. So that's when these sanctions affect us in products to deliver healthcare to our population, to deliver nutrition to our population, to have people mobilize themselves. Thank goodness the revolution has created a lot of transportation for the poor. The metro has been increased by 5 or 6 new lines. We have trains to bring people from outside Caracas to come into Caracas to work. But yet, you can see, for example, right now we have a scarcity on gasoline because all the additives are imported. The additive we use to treat our petroleum and convert it into gasoline. So yes, people are suffering. It's affecting us, and we have to continue fighting to lift those sanctions. It's just inhumane. It's costing lives. It's costing development, and that's why we're here, trying to denounce these criminal sanctions against our countries.
Thank you, Dr. Weber and Ambassador Cabañas. I think that really is what we hope people will take away biggest from tonight's presentation is Cuba's solidarity and internationalism in the face of a brutal US blockade and other US policies that are attempting to strangle countries like Venezuela, especially right now, and really are creating a world of a COVID-19 pandemic that is also more dangerous and more difficult for the vast majority of people around the planet. For our final question tonight, we have one that's been submitted by a journalist, so I thought it'd be a good opportunity to put that out there. Again, there's people on this webinar from all across the world, I imagine, and it's great to have all you here with us tonight, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to everything. This journalist is writing an article about Cuba's medical internationalism, specifically on the Cuban effort to fight the coronavirus in various countries around the world. He is looking for more information about how the Trump government pressures other countries to stop the Cuban medical programs, especially during the coronavirus outbreak, and is also wondering what you have personally experienced being in Washington, Ambassador Cabañas, in the change in policy between the Obama and Trump administrations as it relates to health.
Yes, well, thank you for the question. First, we had the opportunity to be a witness of the exchange that we were able to build basically in 2015, 2016. And I have the perception that at that time we built something like what it could be the foundation of any future attempt to normalize links between Cuba and the United States. We have had agreements on many subjects, and we even had agreements on those subjects where we can agree, or it's very difficult and will take a lot of time. But for the first time in many, many years, probably in history, we had a chance to put on the table those subjects in which we feel that we need to cooperate, we need to talk. There is something simple called geography. I mean, we are very close to each other. Environment, many issues impact us in the same way because we are too close. We have a very large Cuban American community in the United States, as you know, and health particularly is a subject that encompasses us all. You know? Again, I had the chance to witness how the scientific community in the United States is aware and respects all those results that different panelists have explained in details. They understand the benefit of cooperating. We have talked about interferon. We can talk here about Heber-Prot-P to fight diabetes, a disease that affects so many people in the United States, the developed world in general, Canada, of course, and UK. And the amount of information to pass, I mean, FDA or any other regulatory agency to pass and to approve that vaccine, in this case, injection, is paramount. I mean, you have a lot of information. And let me tell you that in the United States, you have something around 60 to 70,000 amputations a year. With that drug in Cuba, we are cutting out 73% of the amputation. You can imagine the tremendous impact that could have in the American population, families, budget. We have been commenting here basically about human health, but let's don't forget animal health. In terms of animal health, we have developed also drugs. I'm thinking particularly now about GAVAC, which is to fight ticks on cattle. As we speak, cattle races in Texas and surrounding states, they have a major issue, and they have had a major issue with ticks for several years, and the losses are paramount. They know, the Texas Agriculture Department, they know, experts there, they know, and people in government here in Washington, they know. That's a way to fix that crisis is through cooperation with Cuba. And in terms of agriculture, we signed 2 different MOUs under the previous administration. My point is those instruments are there. we both can benefit at any time. But regrettably, the path of this administration has been to reverse and to roll back any advances that were made before. We have the knowledge, we have the willingness to cooperate anytime in the future. No one will tell Cubans how to decide things and how to rule our countries. That's our own decision. Then that subject is out of question. But beyond that, in any other subject, and now the argument, as Professor Alexa mentioned, against Venezuela is drug interdiction and narco traffic. Well, if we were all in the Caribbean Sea to cooperate, certainly it would be bad news for the traffickers. But this is not what the United States is doing these days. What it has been said about Venezuela and has been said about Cuba, about drug interdiction these days, is in complete conflict with what federal agencies in the United States know about cooperation, at least with Cuba. You can ask any relevant official at the Coast Guard system for how many years we have been working together to prevent narco traffic for taking place. Again, if this happens in the near future, I don't know how many years, but still Cubans and our government will be ready to sit and talk about those issues we need to address bilaterally, and no doubt health is a relevant issue on that list of subjects. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Cabañas. So we are close to getting to the ending time here for our presentation. I want to thank all of the speakers that joined us here tonight: Ambassador Cabañas, Dr. Alexa Weber, Dr. Helen Yaffe, Dr. Kirk, Dr. Isaac Saini. It has been a really educational and I think motivating, especially webinar tonight. We are all, as solidarity activists, getting used to this kind of organizing where we can't organize street protests or go to talk to people door to door, but where we are meeting each other on the internet. And I think we will continue to learn from this, and I really appreciate everyone attending. There's a few things I want to close with tonight. We especially want to encourage people to continue working against the US blockade on Cuba. If you are located in Canada or the United States, there are organizations such as the National Network on Cuba that can help you connect with your local Cuba Solidarity organization in many cities across the US. In Canada, there's the Canadian Network on Cuba that can also put you in touch with your local group. There's also the important campaigns we talked about, campaigns about interferon alpha 2B. Again, to get involved with that, you can email interferon@us-cuba-normalization.org. There's also a campaign out of Canada for anyone that is located in Canada or outside of the United States that is raising money for Cuba's effort to fight COVID-19 internationally. You can find out more of that on the website of the Canadian Network on Cuba. And I also wanted to invite people to the next webinar being organized by the US-Cuba Normalization Conference. The same group that came together for tonight is organizing a webinar at the same time, which is 5 p.m. Pacific time, 8 p.m. Eastern time, to talk about the community response to COVID-19 around the world, but especially talking more about building campaigns here in the United States and Canada. And there'll be a number of different speakers, including the Cuban ambassador to Canada, Josefina Vidal. So I encourage people to mark your calendars for April 18th for the next webinar that we are hosting. I also wanted to let people know again that these videos will be available on the website of the US-Cuba Normalization Conference, us-cubanormalization.org, and to say that we are still looking forward to having an in-person International Cuba Solidarity Conference in November of 2020. This conference will take place in New York City, November 14th and 15th, and you're welcome to get involved now or to put it in your calendars for later, and to get more information and also to donate to this conference, which we'll continue to do online webinars, but also we'll be planning on bringing in speakers and providing an excellent conference, which of course takes money. I encourage people to visit the website us-cubanormalization.org in order to donate, and there'll also be more information on the final slide. So I'll give it to Claudia maybe to say a final goodbye, but again, thank you all for joining, and let's continue to build a more united and stronger movement to lift the criminal US blockade on Cuba.
This was definitely educational and most definitely a necessary webinar and conversation to have. I want to join in thanking the panelists for sharing so much knowledge with all of us. I think we leave this space, the spiritual space, knowing and reaffirmed that we have the task of defending life and therefore defending the projects that defend life, such as Cuba and Venezuela. And we are committed in our struggle, which is an internationalist struggle, which is the struggle of people who are workers, who have been historically marginalized by systems and structures that are there to profit and exploit us. And so we want to thank once again the panelists here, and I take with me, and I hope we take with us some of what the ambassador shared with us. We may be in quarantine, but solidarity is well out and alive. And we need to make sure that we bring that flag out in the world. And this is a very important, critical time to organize. We are learning about new methods of organizing that are also very, very key because they allow us to have an international space such as this. In a lot of ways, when we are incubated in locality, in our small spaces, it's very hard to have these conversations with international comrades. And so this new way of organizing for us allows us that opportunity. So we want to thank you for joining us and from logging in the morning of the mornings and in the evenings of the evenings. Folks came together and we had a very important discussion. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Just to say, I did have the time incorrect for the forum on the 18th of April. It's actually 2 p.m. Eastern, so it's a daytime forum on Saturday, April 18th for the next webinar. And I also encourage people to visit the big petitions websites, including change.org. If you search Cuba and blockade and interferon, you'll find a number of petitions that need our support right now. And Ambassador Cabañas, do you want the final word?
Well, we have to be quite appreciative of this effort. We know how it takes for you. For the faces has been visible now, Alison and Claudia, but we have had Ike, Gail, and Cheryl, and a lot of organizers in Canada and United States. You mentioned the campaigns you have supported in the past. Remember the Cuban 5. We don't talk that often anymore, but we in Cuba, we feel that part of its freedom is related to the kind of support we receive from you in Canada, United States, UK, and many other places. You have been key to organize conferences like the one you mentioned. We have to remember recently that the one that was organized by Dalhousie University and professors Isaac and John were a key part of that. Then we thank you a lot on behalf of my people in Cuba, on behalf of those doctors and nurses and experts that are all over the world fighting the pandemic, our authorities, our president, of course. We thank you, my minister. We thank you a lot for organizing this webinar. And as you said, we have to discover new methods, and we will have to be working we have to do networking to talk to each other, particularly these days. Thank you again.
Thank you for Cuba's example.
Viva Cuba.
Viva Cuba.
Thank you for inviting me all the way from Scotland, Glasgow, where it's now 3 o'clock in the morning.
Thank you for staying with us.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay, I'm leaving. Night.